This is Dr. Ben Weitz with the Rational Wellness Podcast, bringing you the cutting edge information on health and nutrition from the latest scientific research and by interviewing the top experts in the field. Please subscribe to the Rational Wellness Podcast on iTunes and YouTube, and sign up for my free ebook on my website by going to drweitz.com. Let's get started on your road to better health. Hello, Rational Wellness Podcasters. Dr. Ben Weitz here. Thank you so much for joining me again today. For those of you who enjoy listening to the Rational Wellness Podcast, please go to iTunes and give us a ratings and reviews so more people can find out about the Rational Wellness Podcast. Our topic for today is breathing. How important is breathing? What proper breathing is, why breathing properly is important for our health, and how improper breathing can lead to the following health consequences: neck and back pain, the inability to recover from injuries, fatigue, depression and anxiety, stress, concentration and memory problems, reduced performance for athletes, and an inability to work through emotional trauma or grief. While there are a large number of different breathing techniques out there, especially when you start looking at all the different forms of breathing coming out of the yoga tradition. But when it comes to the more therapeutic forms of breathing, breathing through your nose and deep, slow belly breathing rather than shallow, rapid mouth breathing seem to be two of the more important concepts I've come across. Today, our special guest is Emma Ferris. She's an acupuncturist, a Pilates instructor, a registered physiotherapist, and a public speaker, and she's joining us all the way from New Zealand. Emma created an online breathing hub called the Butterfly Effect, and she offers the Big Exhale breathing course to help patients recover from dysfunctional breathing patterns. Emma, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ben, for having me.
Good. So can you explain how you became so interested in breathing as a form of therapy?
Well, breathing kept coming up in my life with my experiences, both with my patients as a physical therapist. But my first exposure to learning about breathing was when I was around 12 years old. And I struggled with a speech impediment and a stutter. And so for me, I started at a very early age getting some speech and drama and therapy for that. And one of the most important things for that was learning to breathe, and particularly learn to breathe into my belly. So I learned that, but I never connected the dots as I went through my physical therapy training. We often put things in silos, which they often do in medicine and healthcare. You know, cardio, respiratory was over here, and neuro, or the brain work was over here, and then musculo, which I was really fascinated with fixing neck, back pain, all that sort of stuff. That was kind of what I loved. But what really changed for me was the patients that I couldn't fix. And it frustrated with me, you know, the neck pain, the back pain that kept coming back. People that struggled with the multiple symptoms that went with it, the fatigue, the anxiety, the poor sleep. And I guess in my training and in my life experiences, it wasn't really explained how connected that was until I began to dig a bit deeper and look at what the underlying cause is and what the why is. And that's obviously what you're all about here too, Ben, is finding out what the why behind people getting to that place of dysfunction. So definitely my patients began to show it up for me. And then I had my own life crisis when I was around 28, when I got pregnant with a condition called hyperemesis gravidarum. So it's extreme morning sickness. And I realized that all the things I'd done before that point with my life, I had a busy physio practice, I was teaching, I was running workshops, and my body was running on empty before I even started to carry this little baby, little human being. And I ate okay, and I did a bit of exercise, but the reality was that's not good enough. And my nervous system was just shot. So I learned then that what I'd been doing beforehand wasn't good enough. And so I went into this process of researching and starting to formulate my own thesis. And I began a bit of a mongrel with breathing. So I got all these different ideas from yoga and Pilates and Buteyko and Braidcliff breathing and all these different versions. And what really sat with me for learning about breathing was it's actually the story about why we connect with every person, why that's important, and why breathing makes a difference. But the reason they got there in the first place, what was their stress and trauma, or what was the moment that got them to learn to need to change? And I think that's so important because most of us come out breathing like babies that are beautiful, belly, glorious breathing. So we don't come out, sometimes some people do come out screaming and yelling and not breathing very well, but most of the time we're naturally belly breathers. So things happen along that process, whether it's trauma, illness, infections, stress, and then the habit gets stuck. And so I'm all about looking at the why, but retraining the habit and looking at the science behind it and the muscles, because that's, as a physical therapist, that's what I treat a lot of, motor patterns, dysfunction. And that actually has a huge component with breathing retraining. Yeah.
So that's interesting. So we start out as mouth breathers. Is that what you said?
No, we started as nose breathers.
Oh, okay.
Nose breathers.
Okay.
But belly breathing. Sorry. So we start out with this beautiful, slow belly breathing. Watch a baby sleep. It's just glorious. And they do it so naturally.
Right. So can you go into some of the details about what proper breathing is and why is it so important to breathe through your nose rather than your mouth?
Yeah. Well, I'll go into the nose and the mouth breathing concept in a second, but a lot of it's all about the reaction to stress and how our body's nervous system gets overridden with breathing. So breathing is both under conscious and unconscious control. And that's the really powerful point because we have the power to actually override our autonomic nervous system, which more often than not gets pushed with our busy modern day lives or the stresses we have in it. And that changes us or push into what we call your sympathetic nervous system, which I know you've talked about before on the podcast. And the reaction to stress, whatever it is, whether it's past, present, or future, drives us to change our breathing. So if you imagine that lion's chasing us, we take a big breath in, we inhale, and we use our neck and shoulder muscles. We prepare our hip flexor muscles that like to get us out of danger. And we use these muscles to mobilize and get more air in. Now, that's really important for that stress or danger that's coming after us. But if that danger is a relationship issue or a problem with somebody at work, or you've had back and neck pain for a long time, and even the thought process behind that keeps you stuck in that space of going, oh, this is dangerous, I'm sore, I'm going to get sore if I do this. Then our response to what danger is activates that fear center in our brain to trigger that reaction. And so the problem is we get stuck in that cycle. And one of the main things that change is our breathing. So we become faster. We begin to breathe through our mouth because that's a faster way of getting air in and getting more oxygen, which again is important for exercise and in times of stress to get us out of danger, but not all the time. So it's learning why we use it. People say to me, should we be using our nose all the time? And it's like, well, no, that's not practical because when you walk up a hill, your body is going to need to get more oxygen in. So you need to be able to go to mouth. But it's as soon as possible going back to that nose breathing and reconnecting with it. So the reason why the nose is important is because it's got 2 holes versus 1 for the mouth. And so it slows the air down. Like, it's simple concepts, but if you can use that, it slows the air down, which is really important for your diaphragm. And the diaphragm is your main breathing muscle. And that sits between your rib cage and your stomach, I should say, and your lungs. And learning to use your diaphragm in the right way is really what, for me, changes people's perception and understanding of breathing. So it's not about taking big breaths. And that's the concept I want people to be aware of as well. When you say, take a big breath, it'll calm you, that doesn't actually work always. That can actually stimulate you more. So for me, it's about low, slow belly breathing and long exhale, which is why my program is called the Big Exhale. So learning to get out of that fight or flight inhale mode and learning to drop the chest down. And that's really important for neck and back pain, which we can talk about a bit more later on.
And why is it more important to have a longer exhale?
Well, that's one of the easiest ways to activate that parasympathetic nervous system. So activating that teaches the body that it can go into that rest, digest, and recovery mode. And that's why in yoga and pranayamas and all this techniques like Tai Chi work on lengthening that exhale. Free diving, Pilates meditation, naturally they're getting you conscious of your breathing, which is activating that parasympathetic nervous system. That's why people feel good doing those activities, but you don't always know why. So, and the other reason is that we're not meant to be driven into that fight or flight response. And we do when our blood chemistry changes over time when we're breathing too fast. Now, I know you've talked about this before with Rosalba Courtney, who I'm a really big fan of. She's a wonderful breathing teacher around the world, an osteopath from Australia. Now, the blood chemistry shifts when you're breathing too fast. And what it does is you by breathing out too much carbon dioxide, which is way more important than oxygen, you end up increasing your pH and making it more alkaline. So over time, that if your body stays in that state, it thinks that new level of CO2 balance is what you're supposed to go to, and keeps you driven physiologically to breathe in that faster state. So learning to lengthen your exhale also overrides that new level of normal, or what you think is normal. And that's really important for anxiety, patients who are struggling with anxiety, with shortness of breath and its suffocation response. And so a lot of the techniques that are out there are great, like Buteyko, which gets you to lengthen your exhale to increase that CO2 level response, so that your brain goes, okay, I can now hold for longer. I don't feel that fear and danger response of suffocation, which means I need to take a big breath in, and gets you stuck in that inhale mode.
Most of us think that the whole purpose of breathing is just to get oxygen. So can you talk about why getting enough carbon dioxide is important?
Well, CO2 has a really big impact onto both the pH, like I say, because it actually shifts by breathing out too much CO2, you shift the pH, and then your body's going to try and replace that acidic component, and it's going to start leaking bicarbonate into the blood. So it has a bit of a knock-on effect into so many systems. One of the other impacts is the brain. So when you change that pH and the CO2 depletes, you actually reduce the blood flow to the brain, which is why there's a connection with memory and concentration, brain fog, whatever you want to call it, processing and cognition. And for learning, that's a really important part for children and for adults. And one of the things that I find really powerful is when people get stuck in that faster stressed breathing, and our habits contribute to that, like caffeine or alcohol that can shift our breathing with stimulants. We don't realize then that our body will be shifting its blood chemistry, and that takes a while to recover. And even those habits and stimulants can actually then create a shift in the blood chemistry, which then creates more anxiety and other components, or poor sleep that gets you stuck in that cycle. So the pH is pretty powerful. One of the other things is it actually causes, with that shift in pH, your blood is going to go from our limbs and our extremities, because we're not worrying about feeding the blood into the limbs and the hands when you are in that stress state. This is important for athletes as well. So it's going to divert our blood flow to areas that need it, like our organs. And so we can get cold fingers and toes. This is one of the signs of breathing dysfunction. I get tingling in fingers and as well. And so there's a change even in our blood flow and our brain and our organs. We just divert things around because of that physiological shift.
Cool. And so what's the importance of deep belly breathing, as opposed to, I guess, more shallow chest breathing?
Yeah. One thing is that it's changing the right breathing muscles to work. So most of the breathing, like 70 to 80% of our breathing, should come from our diaphragm, our big belly breathing muscle. But what happens when you're stressed and you start to use the inhale, gets stuck with what we call breath stacking, where you breathe in and you hold, and then you might breathe out a little bit, but then your brain goes, oh, I feel like I'm suffocating. I'll take another breath in. Then you get stuck in that inhale mode and using our backup breathing muscles, what I call your parachute reserve. And these are your neck muscles, your scalenes on the side of your neck, your sternocleidomastoid from the front of your neck, all the way back up into your head and your skull, down into your sternum, and your upper traps, those muscles that get really sore and tight at the back of your shoulder. Now, we see them all the time clinically. I know you do too, Ben, with our patients. They give you headaches. And this is a really important point, because we're using those muscles between depending on your breathing frequency, between 17,000 and 21,000 times a day, the amount of breaths we take. So if you're using the wrong muscles in the first place, you're going to cause more trigger points. Those achy, knotty spots that can become active and refer, can be trigger point headaches or trigger point referral down the arms. So that's one of the main ones, is that you're actually using the wrong muscle all the time. And it's like a reverse triangle. You start using the top part and not the bottom part. So teaching how to use a diaphragm is really important, but also what I talk about is 360-degree breathing. So that diaphragm has attachments right from the front of your stomach, all the way around the ribs, down the sides, because it sits like a dome, and all the way into your lower back and into by your L1, L2, your lower vertebrae, and your hip flexor, your flight or fight stress muscle. And it has that neural connection through there, which is pretty powerful. So learning to activate the diaphragm is really important for both intra-abdominal pressure, and there's a lot of research now looking at diaphragm function and dysfunction with back pain. And when someone has an episode of back pain, one of the first things they're going to do is inhale and protect, and they actually lose that activation of the diaphragm, which actually is needed to actually stabilize. So you get in this vicious cycle because they're not breathing right. Then they create more trigger points because their physiology changes, and then they also feel more stressed and feel anxious about being in pain. And so when they go to bend or twist, they go, oh, this is how I injured my back last time, I better protect. So from the point of view of the diaphragm, it has several roles. Respiration's king, speech is queen, and I guess the next one is stability. So if you're walking up a hill, first thing that's going to go is stability. You start to not stabilize very well, and then your speech, and then respiration. So that's always going to be the key thing. So then you start to recruit some other muscles. So it's really important to look at that role of diaphragm, but to understand that it's a one-way muscle, and that so it only works on that inhale. And then if you learn to lengthen your exhale and relax as the diaphragm recoils back up, then you can activate that parasympathetic nervous system. But a lot of the time when I'm looking at people that have been training yoga or training other techniques, they're actually forcing the air out and causing that COT balance to actually be shifted just by the way they're breathing. So a lot of it's just conscious retraining in moments. You don't have to lie down for 20 minutes, meditate. It can be, I'm going to stop right now on my drive around LA or New Zealand and just pause and exhale. Simple things add up.
You ever find restrictions in the diaphragm and have to use manual techniques to free those up? Yeah.
Absolutely. And all of those breathing muscles, so scalenes, first ribs, upper traps. And I use a lot of dry needling, or I think, what do you guys call it over there? Trigger point needling.
Yeah.
And that's really effective for releasing the result of the poor breathing pattern. But unless you change the breathing pattern, the driver and the why, it comes back.
Right.
So I love the manual therapy work.
Yeah, we find chiropractic manipulation also beneficial in those cases as well.
And particularly for thoracic, because if you're not getting thoracic mobility and rib cage, you're not going to get that lower stability. Right. So I 100% agree, because that also goes into that parasympathetic loop, the autonomic nervous system.
Yeah.
So I love manual therapy. There's so many ways of getting somebody into a calm state. That's why I love acupuncture as well, to kind of go, look, what is the right formula for a person in front of you?
Yeah, one of the conditions we didn't talk about, or I didn't mention, which comes to mind when you talk about rest and digest, is IBS or SIBO. And I can see how breathing could be really super important for those patients, because if they're always in this sympathetic mode, they're never going to properly digest their food, and it's just going to increase all their digestive symptoms.
Absolutely. And I've seen some of the research showing that stress mode, if you're stuck in stress and that sympathetic, then you actually change the bacteria in your stomach in the first place. So one of the great things of learning to actually use a diaphragm is that you're actually going to pump through, get that intestines to actually work in the right way, get the blood flow. And when you are in that stress state, blood flow is diverted from your bowel and your stomach, because when you're running away from that lion, you're not worried about processing food. There are 3 areas that get shut down. Hormones, so particularly females, and we're seeing that a lot with infertility problems these days, but that cycle and upset from that by being stuck into that sympathetic drive. and immunity. So we get colds and flus and we run down and we're stressed, and particularly our digestive system. So there's so many more problems these days, all because of our inability to manage stress. And that comes in so many forms. And there's a lot of pressure by society that drives us. And I just think the more that we can get this understanding out there, because people are hungry. There's a groundswell of looking at techniques that are focused on holistic treatments like the manual therapy, like acupuncture, like yoga, because it makes you feel good in a way that is, not a pill in a bottle. It's very hard to override that nervous system.
Yeah. When it comes to nose breathing, when I talk to clients, there's so many people that have problems with allergies and with, issues not being able to breathe properly. How do you deal with some of those issues? If you're trying to get them to breathe through their nose and their sinus passages are partially clogged, or they have deviated septum, or they have allergies, or they have, some of these chronic respiratory problems.
They're huge problems, and that can be the driver in the first place for getting stuck in the habits. But then also that habit of mouth breathing gets them stuck with the sinus problems as well, because they're not actually using that nose as a filter and keeping the blood flow through there. So it's really problem solving for that individual. And so one of my first steps, if someone is struggling, is getting them back to the doctor and check for any polyps and any problems, ENT if they need to. And then there's simple things that you can do, like sinus rinses. Have you done them, Ben? Sinus rinse?
Yeah.
People don't always like them, but they are so satisfying, and that's a really good way of cleaning out the nose and allowing it to get that filter through. And one of them is learning to breathe through both nostrils, because you actually switch nostrils through the day that you breathe through. Did you know that? So every 1 to 4 hours, you're switching nostrils. So one side becomes the one you're breathing through, and the other side is like the cleaning system. So if you have one side that is actually blocked, you've got deviated septum, then even in your sleep, you'll be switching through to mouth breathing because you're short of air. So getting that corrected is very important. And doing those steps before you try anything like mouth taping, because that's not for everybody. You've got to check people's saturations and stuff as well. But, I use it myself. I use it on different patients, and it's very successful. So it's not a one-size-fits-all model for nose breathing.
How do you decide when it's appropriate for somebody to do mouth taping? And can you explain what mouth taping is? This is where you use special tape to shut your mouth while you're sleeping, right? To keep it closed?
Yeah, absolutely. And you don't need to have much on there, because a lot of people you can open your mouth. People go, "Oh, that feels really scary. I don't like the idea of that." And it's always a bit of a joke with patients, that they like keep them quiet. And I say, look, you can just say goodnight to your partner and husband, then roll over and then take your mouth up. They don't have to see it. But it actually it's really effective for then getting that diaphragm to actually activate when you're sleeping in the first place, instead of going to that mouth breathing. But really what people have got to think about is, I'll come back to note taping in a second, but your breathing at night is a consequence of what you've been doing with your habits in the day. So if you have been caffeinated, which is a very strong culture we have, and you've been pushing your body hard and driving it hard, and you're basically running a marathon through the day with your breathing, then when you go to sleep, your body's not going to go, "Oh, I'm going to go calm and relax." It's going to go, breathe fast, breathe fast, breathe fast. And so you're not going to sleep well. You're not going to get into that nice delta wave when you're sleeping. You're going to keep in that mouth breathing. So the taping is, again, it's dependent on to make sure that people can breathe through here. So I often we test to check that they can put like a knife or a spatula under there, and we can see if they're breathing through both nostrils. We can check the nasal sides. I usually get an ENT to check, or a doctor to check, to make sure there's no polyps or anything else in there. And we check saturation as well, to make sure when you do practice that, so practice it before you go to sleep, lie around, have a lie down and see how that feels, that they don't get too anxious or short of breath with that, and that their saturation levels don't drop down. So it's kind of looking at the why behind that person. It's used really commonly, but again, you don't use it for just everybody. I have a lot of athletes, because they have already been breathing too much, mouth breathing too much in the daytime, and with their training, that they don't realize that that's still contributing to their recovery at night. And so when they start doing that, they sleep better, their muscles are less tense, they don't need as much magnesium, which is to relax muscles and help with recovery.
Interesting. So can everybody change their breathing, or are some people just stuck with mouth breathing?
Well, there's some physiological reasons which would be driving you to breathe faster. And so it's really important you do get checked out by your doctor. what we find is that breathing dysfunction is often the last thing that gets diagnosed. And there's reasons like diabetes, that can be a reason why you're driving faster. A lot of patients, I work with a lot of people with Parkinson's as well, and the anxiety behind that also drives you to breathe faster, but then the breathing faster drives you to have more anxiety. And so that anything that has low dopamine is a big part of it. So there are some people that need either medical support to help shift and get them into a good space. Like, I don't say that this is going to cure everybody. Like, there's not a one size fits all model, but learning to use breathing as an adjunct, like with asthma, it's a really important part. It's like 40% of people that have are asthmatic also have breathing dysfunction in there. So you alongside the tools until that you can wean off or get the support and work with the respiratory physio to help get that under control. So there's lots of conditions that also benefit highly from training your breathing, making more conscious of it, but anybody can do it. And in regards to how long it takes, it depends how long you've been stuck in that fight or flight mode. And I have a patient that I worked with recently, or the last year really, and he's a good example of someone that he came into his doctor with several factors: not sleeping well. He's 40. He was going through a cardiac experience, so he went to the emergency room thinking he was having having a heart attack. And he was getting tingling in fingers and arms. He's getting so many symptoms of the body, stomach problems, erection dysfunction, which is also sexual dysfunction, can be also linked into breathing dysfunction, because you've got to be able to get arousal, both sympathetic and parasympathetic, with your breathing. So it's an important area looking for all aspects. So this guy, his doctor finally was very switched on and went, I think your breathing's part of it, and sent him out to see me. And over 3 or 4 sessions, that stress dropped down dramatically, and it was a huge shift for him. And so he basically the why behind it though was he was going through a huge court case, trying to get custody of his children through a big divorce, and that had been driven him. And he was really PTSD. He was post-traumatic stress with this getting this marriage, struggling with balancing business and life. And it wasn't until he got those tools he could recover. But there was a lot more behind the scenes for that too, with family experiences. And so you've got to dig deeper and not go, there's not just a habit, there is the driver and the why behind it. And when he started to see that his breathing pattern was actually linked to emotions, so when he came in, I'd be like, okay, so what's the fear today, mate? Because he'd be up here and holding that upper chest, breathing in and be holding and be like, yeah, okay, no, this is what's happening in my life. And when he actually talked about it and expressed it, it dropped away. And belly breathing, learning to actually activate the diaphragm, is also linked in with your emotions, with happiness and joy. So that's one of the powerful things I find too, is that it's not just about breathe through your nose and breathe through your belly. It actually has an impact onto emotions. And the research for me that's changed it it's a few years ago now, I can't remember, 2011. There's a guy called Pierre Philpott. And he did this research study, and I love it because for me, emotions are what is important in life. We connect, we interact with people, relationships are huge. So what it showed was he had this group A, and they looked at 4 emotions: sadness, joy, fear, and anger. And he asked that first group to think of those emotions, and then looked at their breathing patterns. And each emotion had a separate breathing pattern. So I look at that clinically. We see fear and anger is upper chest breathing. We see, fear, upper chest breathing. Anger is bracing and holding through our stomachs and obliques, which has a big impact onto stomach and digestive system. Sadness is often that depressive posture, that slumped down teenagers posture that impacts, again, the way we breathe. And then joy breathing is that belly breathing, opening up into that stomach. So what he found in the other group, Group B, who knew nothing about Group A, was he said, breathe in these 4 patterns, and then what emotion do you feel? I mean, that's the top summary of it. And it was either joy, sadness, fear, or anger. So we have the power to change our emotions by the way we breathe, and we have the power to change our breathing by the way our emotions, which is why coming back to simple practices like gratitude, which, hard to put the science behind that, but it's getting there. Our mindset and our shifts behind that has a huge physiological impact onto our body and the way that we breathe. And our breathing has a huge impact onto the way we sleep, the way we play, the way we love. It's huge.
Cool. You work with people on a one-on-one basis as well as offering group classes, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So when you're working with a professional athlete, how is that different? And do you have them try to breathe through their nose while they're running or doing their athletic performance?
Yeah, so it depends on the athlete and what their sport is. Many athletes need to train specifically for what they're doing. So I work with like swimmers and rowers and cyclists all have different aspects. And many of the sports that actually impact diaphragm position, like rowing and cycling, because they beat forward, have more breathing dysfunction in the first place. So they've got to work harder to control that. And often there's a high link with back pain and just neck pain because of that, because they're having to switch between. So the reality is when I look at training somebody, it goes back to breathing pattern first. So how are they breathing? Have they got the right control? Can they activate the diaphragm? And you might have to train them for a while to get that right in the first place. Once you've got pattern right, then you go to strengthening. And I use a great device called a power breathe. Have you heard of that before?
No.
So power breathe is so I've talked about exhaling being really important. In that first phase, it really is getting that long exhale and activating, because if you can't exhale, you can't inhale. It sounds really silly again, but if you don't get that diaphragm to lift up and exhale, you can't actually get the power into it to actually get the right inhale into the base. So for that second stage, particularly for athletes, though I do use this for people that have got anxiety, neck pain, back pain, COPD problems as well, we use a device called Power Breathe. And that is inspiratory muscle training. So it's in training your diaphragm to actually be strong for the activity. And it's pretty powerful. It's only the science behind it, the research shows 30 breaths twice a day using this inspiratory muscle trainer is enough to get the same results as there was one research study that showed over 6 weeks, I think it was 4 to 6 weeks, they did the research, and one group was using the inspiratory trainer and the other group was running 45 minutes 5 times a week, and they had the same changes in their respiratory function from doing the diaphragm strengthening. So it's a lovely adjunct to training for people, because they can actually get really good changes in physiology, respiratory physiology, because their diaphragm's getting thicker. And it also shows after 6 weeks of using that your diaphragm thickens from up to around 13%, which is quite a lot for
how does this device work? Does it wrap around you or something like that?
I actually left mine at the clinic, so I was going to show you. No, it's in your mouth. So you put it in your mouth and you're going a quick breath in and into the using your diaphragm to get in there. So it's a quick breath in, fast and hard. You've got to work at least 50% resistance to get the diaphragm. So they learned from the research as well that you can't go at like resistance training for like 30% on your 1 rep maximum isn't actually enough to get the changes in your diaphragm strengthening. It needs to be that 50% to 60% mark. And so I test people in the clinic, but you can work at it to sort of feel where that energy is or that level is for you when you train it. It's a company out of the UK that's created them, and there's a wonderful respiratory physiologist, I think she is Alison Connell, I want to say her name is, that's looked at a lot of this research. And there's great research now, even in New Zealand, the physio in Auckland is looking, they did a Braidcliff breathing at the diaphragm changes in the strengthening and the dysfunction that occurs, people with anxiety, with back pain, and looking at that under ultrasound, which is pretty cool. So seeing those changes.
I've seen people in the gym with these things. So it's some sort of a mouthpiece. And what does it do exactly? Yeah. Makes it harder to get a breath in, or?
Absolutely. I mean, it's like breathing through lots of straws. So kind of you can get respiratory through there. So it's like dumbbells for your diaphragm, kettlebell for your diaphragm. Okay. And so if that's targeting that breathing muscle, you still want the pattern to be right though. So some of the research, I went and saw a respiratory researcher in Canada about 2 years ago who was researching the inspiratory muscle training with athletes. And what they noticed was the pattern still, if you don't breathe in the right pattern, all your training is the upper chest breathing muscles, and what you want still is that diaphragm. So it might mean you turn the resistance down and you work on the pattern, but then that diaphragm strengthens to actually help. Therefore, if it's working at a higher level, when you go and run or when you go and lift something, it's going to naturally activate and do its job, so it doesn't fatigue faster. And what I loved about the research there as well, another company, I think it was in the UK, they looked at the blood flow in the limbs. So they're looking at when you were doing your exercise and training. So I think this was on cycling athletes. They looked at the blood flow in your veins in the legs. And what they found is after 6 weeks of doing the the respiratory muscle training with the Power Breath, I think it was the device they used, they reduced the blood flow stayed in the limbs for longer. So what it showed was the body's stress response was better. So the body didn't go, right, I can train harder, and then when I get fatigued, I need to pull the blood in. It could actually keep the blood in the limbs for longer, which is really important for athletes, for endurance, and for training. So lots of consequences with using something like that.
Right. And how do you
oh, sorry.
How do you tell if they're using their diaphragm? Do you put your hand on their diaphragm, or you?
Yeah, I'm very manual with it. So very much feeling that. You can see it. You can get them to put hands on their chest while they've got one hand here, and they don't, or use a mirror, biofeedback in any way that you've got there. Posture is a huge part of that. So if you slump down and then you try and breathe, your diaphragms, you're going to start recruiting somewhere else. If you lift up too much, you're going to use your upper chest. So even teaching people where neutral is, like, again, simple habits add up. And that's a big motto for me, is small changes make a big impact with what we're doing.
Yeah, we work a lot with posture, and that's super important, and it goes hand in hand with the breathing.
Yeah, absolutely. So using that posture, resetting that with your breathing is a very powerful tool. And then add some gratitude, and you're doing really well.
Great. So any other final thoughts you want to have for our audience? I think we got some good information to help folks with their breathing.
I think my take home, and something that I really like to people just to be aware of, is just take a moment and through the day as many times as you can just to exhale. And the one thing I can say is you can do it out the mouth just once. So do it for me now, Ben. Breathe out the mouth, go. Notice how your chest drops down. So that's like a little valve release. Then go back to nose breathing. But that little wee exhale just drops you a bit more into that calm part of that nervous system that needs a bit of love and attention. So do it when you have the kids, when something's winding you up, when you've got traffic wherever you are. I don't have much traffic in my small town in New Zealand where I live, but you never know in LA and around the world.
Oh yeah, LA
you need to have a little more control.
Brutal all the time. Yep.
So take moments and use it to change that breathing. And when you think about that lot of conscious drop, see what emotion you can bring up. Can you create joy? Can you shift your mindset, which will then impact your nervous system? Okay, yeah, take power back.
I'll be using it on a drive home because I'll be hitting the 4 o'clock traffic. And then I'm going to go vote after that. So I'll need some stress reduction there too.
Well, and the next few days, good luck in America is all I can say.
God help the world.
Yeah, and please help us out over here.
So how can listeners get a hold of you and find out about your programs?
Well, there's a few ways. I have my online breathing hub called the butterflyeffect.online. So if you go through or search the Big Exhale or my name, Emma Ferris, Ferris. I'm not related to Tim Ferris. I've got only one S at the end of my name. If you can find me there, and there's lots of ways. I have a free online Pilates video, 15 minutes that you can do, which helps work through some of the stretches that I do. Because what I find is if you can't get the neck muscles and chest muscles and the hip flexor to release, then the breath won't drop down too. So that's there. Please sign up and join in and watch that. I also have my online breathing course called the Big Exhale, and that's a 30-day program, but you can do it over a whole year. And the first 5 days of it are free. So if you want to sign up for the Big Exhale, you can do that. Or join me on a workshop, come to New Zealand, come on my retreats, or meet me around the world in Malaysia or wherever the next one's going to be. I have taught retreats in the States, so I can fly over and change the way that we breathe in the States post-election.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Emma, I really enjoyed this talk.
Thank you. Appreciate having me on.
Okay. I'll talk to you soon.